It is called the cradle of humanity, the crucible of civilization. The West owes him a lot of the foundations of its culture. Thousands of years have had no impact on the quality of the treasures of art and architecture bequeathed by these ancient populations. This is Egypt. Egypt, land of civilization. Located at the gates of Africa, at the crossroads of three continents, Egypt is bordered to the north by the Mediterranean Sea and to the east by the Red Sea. Egypt is the life of an island that crosses it from side to side, from south to north. A river 6,670 kilometers long. Its most remote source gushes in Burundi, just above Lake Victoria. She gives birth to the White Nile, which joins the Blue Nile in Khartoum, born from Lake Tana in Ethiopia. Their waters flow slowly to the north of Cairo, to widen into a delta almost 200 kilometers wide, and finally find access to the Mediterranean. This river conditions all forms of existence in Egypt. Beyond these shores stretches only an implacable desert, immersed in an overwhelming heat, traversed by scorching sand winds and suffering from an endemic drought. Only a few rare species of plants and animals among the most sober and the most resistant cling here. As for man, only the proximity of the river and its fertile waters allows him to survive. And on its shores, since the dawn of time, man has survived and thrived there. The first traces of organized human life found in this region date back to the Paleolithic age. Man then was nomadic. He lived by gathering and hunting. Between 6,000 and 4,000 years before Christ, the local populations began to settle down. They dried up the marshes to practice cultivation and animal husbandry. At that time they were joined by tributes from Asia Minor and North Africa. From this ethnic fusion came the first true ancestors, the Egyptians of today. From 4000 BC, the region is flourishing. Its inhabitants live in huts made of dried mud and rushes, equipped with relatively comfortable furniture. The cattle are fattening, the harvests are abundant, the fishing is generous, the trade is thriving. Craftsmen produce pottery, tools, jewelry. All this was revealed, in particular, by the study of familiar objects, which they used to bury with their dead. Two separate kingdoms were then formed: Lower Egypt in the Nile Delta, and Upper Egypt in the narrow valley that winds south, on the navigable river, to the cataracts of Aswan. The history of pharaonic Egypt is divided into three periods: the Old, the Middle, and the New Kingdom, separated by intermediate periods, times of social and political unrest, disorder, and instability. On the site of Abydos, a list established in the 3rd century BC by the priest Manetho groups in 30 dynasties, the reigns which succeeded each other during these three empires. The history of Egypt really begins around 3,000 years before Christ, when Narmer, ruler of Upper Egypt, imposes his authority on his northern neighbor, Lower Egypt. They merged the two nations and found the first dynasty. Narmer sets up his capital in Memphis, on the border of the two territories now united. He imposed on the new country a strict political and military unity. He also endows it with a prosperous economy, from which all classes of society benefit. From then on, an important center of civilization develops very quickly. In 30 years of reign, and before being carried away, according to legend, by a hippopotamus, Narmer forges the king, an image of the living god, which will remain acquired to his successors over the centuries. Originally, the Egyptian sovereigns were designated according to an ancient formula, entrusting power to the son-in-law of the previous queen. Incest was frequent, so that the sons could compensate for the possible failure or the disappearance of the father. Aha succeeded Narmer. He is credited with some conquests and the construction of the Memphis Palace. Already at that time, the Egyptians used figurative writing, which they engraved in stone or reproduced on papyri, named after an abundant plant on the banks of the Nile. The process consists in forming leaves by pressing several thicknesses, thin strips drawn from its stem. This ancestor of our paper is unfortunately fragile. It burns easily and suffers from moisture. It was believed that the meaning of the ancient Egyptian script was definitively lost when in 1799, Captain Bouchard, an officer who participated in Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt, discovered in Reset, a small town near Alexandria, a basalt stele which bore an inscription written in 3 different scripts. This Rosetta Stone was entrusted to various scholars who tried in vain to decipher it. Finally, it was a Frenchman, Jean-François Champollion, who 23 years later found the key to the enigma. The stele was mutilated, but thanks to the fact that one of the languages of the inscription was perfectly known, we can very quickly determine the nature of the text. It was a decree promulgated in Memphis by Ptolemy V in 196 BC, long after the conquest of Egypt by the Hellenes, and therefore very logically written in Greek, for those who then administered the country. The other 2 texts were engraved in Demotic, the popular language of the Egyptians, and in hieroglyphs, the language of their notables. By juxtaposing the 3 versions, Champollion succeeds by deduction in determining the meaning of 24 basic hieroglyphs, then some 700 others. By complicating this pictorial alphabet to the extreme, the literate Egyptians had made it incomprehensible to ordinary mortals. From then on, the vulgar language, the Demotic, a kind of elementary shorthand, gradually ends up imposing itself. The Egyptians firmly believed in the existence of a new form of life after death, but they could not conceive that the soul subsists without a carnal envelope. They therefore applied themselves to perfecting their mummification technique. They had not failed to observe the preservative effects of the burning sands and of the dry air of the deserts of Upper Egypt. So it was there that they chose to erect the graves of their illustrious dead. From the end of the 3rd dynasty, they took the form of a pyramid. The first, built in degrees, is that of Zoser. It was built in Saqqara, a site near Memphis, by the most illustrious of architects, the brilliant Imhotep. Imhotep had all the talents. Builder and literate, he was the main minister of the king. After his death, he was even raised by the people to the dignity of god of medicine. Zoser actually inaugurates the time of the pyramids. His tomb is originally a mastaba, a monument built on a single level. Imhotep raises it at the same time that it expands its perimeter. He raises it by 5 degrees. It is literally the staircase that will allow the king to rise to heaven. Later, the burial chamber will be housed in the heart of the pyramid. Here, it is dug under its base, at a depth of 28 meters. In the following century, under the 4th dynasty, Cheops, Chephren, and Mykerinos will have the most famous pyramids built, those of Giza. The Cheops pyramid is the largest, 230 meters on the side, 137 meters high. It consists of more than 2 million limestone blocks, with an average weight of 2.5 tons. The proportions of the monument indicate, on the part of the builders, disturbing knowledge. At its base, the pyramid is to the nearest centimeter, perfectly horizontal. Its sides having an inclination of 51 degrees, 52 minutes. The theoretical height to circumference ratio is exactly pi divided by 2. This precision assumes on the part of the Egyptian architects an exceptional mathematical science. An error of only 2 degrees in the inclination of the sides of the monument would have resulted in a defect of verticality of 15 meters at the top. All these tombs were raised on the western bank of the Nile, where the sun goes down. The stones were extracted from the quarries of Tura, located on the opposite bank, and transported by boat. If we believe Herodotus, 100,000 men worked for 20 years to build this immense monument. They were probably not, as was long believed, forced laborers, but farm workers recruited during the off-season. The basic structure of the pyramid resembled that of Zoser. It was then surrounded by earthen ramps, along which the limestone blocks intended to complete the work were hoisted, somehow smoothing its 4 sides. Most of this exterior cladding was removed some 1,000 years later, during the construction of Cairo. The top of the pyramid of Chephren, however, preserves significant remains. Inside each pyramid, the architects plan a maze of corridors, which lead to 3 burial chambers. One of them contains the king's granite sarcophagus, a granite extracted from quarries located far to the south, near Aswan. Each pyramid is connected by a gallery to a mortuary temple built on the banks of the river. Dug around the monument, pits contained boats intended for the passage of the deceased in his future life. Chephren was not content with a pyramid. He built the famous Sphinx of Giza, which, from the top of its 20 meters, has faithfully guarded for 4,500 years the path that leads to the tomb of his master. The body is that of a lion, symbol of strength and power. The face reproduced may be the face of Chephren himself, or may represent the god Horus watching over the horizon. Gradually, the Egyptians came to devote more effort to the worship of their dead than to that of their divinity. And of all the dead, it is obviously the king who must benefit from the most spectacular posthumous glory. His entire people are called to mobilize to raise these immense monuments intended to preserve the memory of the actions of the pharaoh and to ensure him the most comfortable immortality possible. The 4th dynasty, however, marks the apogee of this gigantism. Already, the 3rd pyramids of Giza, that of Mykerinos, is much less voluminous than that of its predecessors. It is true that the time of its construction is also that of the decline of the old empire. At the end of the 6th dynasty, after a last prestigious reign, and particularly long, that of Pepi II, who died in his mid-40s, the country was undermined by an excess of bureaucracy, and especially by the ambitions of a crowd of local potentates. Around 2180 BC, Egypt is plunged into chaos. This is the first intermediate period that will last a century and a half. The kings succeed each other by the dozens, at the rate of one per day, for weeks, says the legend. It is a time of famine and anarchy. The empire misses falling into this first great test of its history. It is about to be completely dismantled. At the dawn of the second millennium, however, Egypt is regaining its unity. This period, which extends from 1991 to 1786 BC, is known as the Middle Kingdom. It is essentially dominated by the 12th dynasty, and especially by Amenemhat I, who moves the capital from Memphis to Luxor. During these 2 centuries, the Egyptian civilization benefits from a cultural boom and an unprecedented material prosperity. Amenemhat II develops commercial exchanges with its southern neighbors. Amenemhat III organizes the irrigation of thousands of hectares whose cultivation significantly increases food production, and therefore the standard of living. This wealth could not fail to inspire lusts. Tribes from Asia, the Hyksos, infiltrate the delta, from where they spread throughout the country to take control of it. Their regime, which succeed each other from the 15th to the 17th dynasty, covers the second intermediate period. A warrior people, the Hyksos introduced the horse, the battle chariot, bronze weapons to Egypt. 2 centuries later, the Theban princes regained power. They pushed the Hyksos back to Palestine and recreated an independent dynasty, the 18th. The new empire sets up its capital in Thebes. Thutmose I and the other sovereigns who inaugurate this dynasty practice a policy of conquest which aims to protect the country and guarantee its security. These expeditions will lead them far to the south, the current Sudan, and to the northeast, as far as the Euphrates. Thutmose I was the first pharaoh to order that his tomb be dug in the famous Valley of the Kings. The site is close to Thebes, on the opposite bank of the Nile. The landscape is chaotic, landmarks are rare, and this is what will determine the choice of the sovereign, very anxious to keep his secret burial safe from thieves. But his successors by the dozens followed the same reasoning, so that the valley and its funeral destination soon had nothing more secret. There are now 62 hypogees, the name given to these tombs dug into the rock. All of them have been desecrated, some of them as early as the 11th century BC. All except one, that of Tutankhamun, discovered intact in 1922 by an English archaeologist, Howard Carter. The pharaoh was only 18 years old when he died, after an insignificant reign of a few months. No doubt, the grave robbers thought that so young, he had not amassed much treasure. It is to this indifference that Tutankhamun owes to have become, 32 centuries after the end of his so short life, the most famous pharaoh in the world. The discovery of Howard Carter, the tomb of Tutankhamun, contained a treasure of exceptional richness and artistic quality. The sarcophagus contained a triple coffin, the first wooden decorated with gold and silver, the second covered with gold inlaid with glassware, the third finally, more than 3 centimeters thick, in solid gold, enhanced with blue earthenware and natural stones. The mummy herself wore a carved funeral mask in a thick layer of fine gold. An anteroom contained a profusion of works of art, furniture, statues, weapons, chariots, and utilitarian objects. In all, some 700 pieces in ivory, alabaster, wood, or precious metals. They are now the pride of the Cairo Museum, where two of the three coffins that fit together to house the mummy are also on display. The largest has re-entered the tomb of the Valley of the Kings. Tutankhamun rests there again, such as his effigies that Howard Carter described as sad and calm restore it to us, suggesting youth prematurely surprised by death. And if it is true that the thieves once considered these treasures too modest to attract their lust, we start dreaming by thinking of the wonders that the tombs they looted must have contained. Among the ancestors of Tutankhamun in the 18th dynasty, there are the Thutmose, second and third of the name. Illegitimate son, Thutmose III was still a child when his father died. He was removed from power following a palace revolution, then unique in the annals of Egypt. It was his beautiful mother, Hatshepsut, who seized the throne. To justify this confiscation, she did not hesitate to assert herself as the daughter of Ammon, the great god of Thebes. At least we owe him one of the wonders of Egyptian architecture, the Temple of Deir el-Bahari, built on a site near the Valley of the Kings and dedicated to Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. It is famous for the beauty of its bas-reliefs. Many illustrate the commercial expeditions that remain the defining element of this extraordinary reign that lasted almost 15 years. On the death of Hatshepsut, finally returning to power, Thutmose III embarked on a succession of military campaigns, of which he brought back, says the Chronicle, a profusion of wealth and slaves, among whom many Hebrews. Egypt was approaching one of the peaks of its power. The rulers of the neighboring countries sent their sons there so that they could learn there. Returning home as good students, they became the safest allies of their powerful neighbor. Egyptian society was now carefully hierarchized. At the top, the king appears since the advent of the new kingdom of the title of pharaoh, which literally means the great palace. Under the authority of the pharaoh, cascading social classes. An elite, first of all, high-ranking officials, priests, and nobles. Then, a middle class, composed of scribes, artists, soldiers, teachers, traders, and artisans. At the bottom of the ladder, the servants, the peasants, and the workers. And even lower, but relatively few in number, are the slaves. The wealth of the country guarantees everyone relative prosperity, and order reigns. Yet, the Egyptians lack vital space. They are forced to live in the narrow strip of arable land, which runs on both sides of the Nile. Their houses are piled up against each other there. The only solid and comfortable homes are those of the well-to-do. They are vast. Their monumental porches open onto superb courtyards, gardens, shaded pools, outbuildings where the servants stay. They are equipped with splendid furniture made of precious woods, decorated with gold and silver. Chairs and armchairs are covered with tapestries, decorated with inlays of ivory and ebony. The beds are comfortable, equipped with braided cords that act as a box spring, and finely woven linen sheets. It is also from linen that the clothes are made, essentially a kind of loincloth for the man and a long dress for the woman. The servants prepare the food in their own accommodation, which they then serve to their masters in the main building. It consists of poultry meat, fish accompanied by bread, fruit, honey, and served with milk, beer or wine. According to the literature and drawings that have come down to us, all social classes favored a happy family life. The pharaoh was allowed to maintain several wives, but most of the Egyptians were monogamous. The children had their toys, rattles, articulated dolls, and pets. Cats, otherwise considered sacred, dogs, and even baboons. As for the adults, they practiced to distract themselves, the Senate, a checkerboard game, as well as a kind of dice game. Music was highly appreciated by the ancient Egyptians. They played on instruments comparable to the harp, flute, and clarinet. Among their other distractions, dance, wrestling, or magic shows, without forgetting for men, fishing parties tender, and crocodile or hippo hunting. Education was considered essential. The children were learning writing, arithmetic, and geometry, hoping to make a career in high administration. The supreme ambition. We know especially about the ancient Egyptians, their architectural masterpieces. But they were also brilliant when it came to science and literature. They have bequeathed us a considerable sum of songs, poems, chronicles, novels, and adventure stories. One of the latter, which has passed through the ages, tirelessly told to the children, describes the exciting adventures of Sinbad, the sailor. The water, which exerted a great fascination on them, made them experts in shipbuilding. It is a talent which, like that of their architects, supposes an excellent knowledge of the problems of arithmetic or geometry. As for their engineers, in addition to their ability to make some of the most gigantic monuments ever imagined by man spring out of the earth, they also bequeathed to us a technique from which we are still learning lessons, that of irrigation. The floods of the Nile, which can triple the flow of the river, have always kept Egypt under their law. We could write the history of this region with the only common thread, the irrigation policy pursued by its princes. It begins with the construction of a network of canals in the Fayum, a vast depression south of Memphis, from the beginning of the 2nd millennium BC. The observation of the cycle floods, germination, harvests, also inspired the Egyptians the need to develop a calendar. As a starting point, they chose the rising of the star Sirius, which they had found to appear regularly at a determined latitude. Between each appearance of Sirius, in this celestial position, they counted 365 appearances of the sun, corresponding to what still constitutes today the 365 days of our calendar. They also divided the days into 24 hours and created the sundial. Finally, to complete this mastery of time, they invented the clock, in order to determine even more precisely the scrolling of the hours by making water flow into a basin through a hole with a carefully studied diameter. Great too was the reputation of Egyptian medicine. Several papyri that have come down to us justify this fame. A series of them, divided into 877 chapters, concern the diagnosis and the way of curing the sick, which concern practically all parts of the body. Another papyrus codifies the surgical treatment of wounds. Yet another, which is believed to be due to Imhotep and therefore dates back to the Old Kingdom, deals with cardiac disorders. Heart diseases, considered today as modern scourges, were therefore already rampant in antiquity.